Good morning, good afternoon, hello. My name is Mike Tyndall, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Corporate and Market Development here at Profix. I'm pleased to be your host today for a live chat that we're going to be having with our guest, Tom Cheesewright. Tom's a futurist and somebody that we worked with for several years now. It's been a real pleasure working with you, Tom. It was recently brought to our attention that he has written a book on future-proofing your business. And we thought this would be a very useful topic for a broader discussion with our customers, our partners, our prospects, our ecosystem generally. It's very timely to be talking about how companies can prepare themselves to deal with what's coming down the pipe. So I'm really glad to be joined by Tom. Tom, as I said, is a futurist, and what that involves is his working with corporations, with government, with industry bodies, with charities, and providing them with insights and training on how to deal with the future, with critical intersections between today's trends and stresses that organizations may see for their future and how to deal with them. So very pleased that we could have this conversation and that we could have Tom as a guest.
Thanks, Mike.
Before I start, you're most welcome, Tom. Before I start with some of the questions for Tom, let me go through a little bit of the housekeeping. There are several tools at the bottom of your screen that you can use to engage. You can resize them, you can move them around. And if there are any questions during the session today, use the Q&A engagement tool. We'll try and get to as many of them as we can as we're going through the conversation. We'll keep an eye on the questions that are incoming, and to the degree we can, we'll answer them as we go along. We'll also look to answer those that we didn't get to via email after the fact. So I think with that, let's move ahead. Let's hear from Tom. Tom, perhaps what I'll do is open it up by starting by springboarding off of that notion of future-proofing. Obviously, it's one that's very relevant today. We're going through, and here's the term that everyone uses, unprecedented times. Clearly, that's the case, and there's a lot of uncertainty. What are some of the broader dynamics that you're seeing that brings urgency to needing to be future ready?
Yeah, I think, Mike, that word urgency and bringing urgency is a really relevant concept here. In many ways, the whole crisis has acted like a lens which has brought existing pressures into sharper focus. And I'm starting to see more and more companies, particularly more and more leaders, turning onto some trends that maybe other people had started to identify in advance of the crisis. And there's one in particular, and it's really a shift that underpins the book, if you like. And something that I'd started to notice in my conversations with leaders and started to advise other leaders on it. And it's really a philosophical shift that we've seen in that, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is really just the latest example of, or the latest piece of evidence, if you like, that we're living in this age of incredible uncertainty, incredibly rapid change, the sorts of change I talked about in my first book last year, the sort of high frequency change, which is driven by the fact that the world's smaller now. We're in this very condensed environment where global corporations, different countries are hyper-connected in spite of some quite protectionist behaviors around the world. And that there's the price of technology, access to technology is so much greater now than it was. So you get this accelerated rate of innovation and change. And when you bring those two things together, it's taken so much friction out of the world that it's created these very sort of these high frequency waves of change, which really destabilizes people, creates this sense of uncertainty. And so the really big change that I started to see before this crisis, but has been brought into focus by it, has been leaders reacting to that, saying, actually, what does it mean now to operate my business in a world where I don't know that my business model's still going to be good in 12, 24, 36 months' time, where we might see these big disruptive events coming down the pipeline, maybe only appearing on the near horizon and blowing through our industry and causing major disruption. And the shift they've started to make is say, well, actually, my success till now has been built on optimization. How do I do better tomorrow what I did yesterday? Where better is typically with more growth, more revenue, more profit. And they're starting to say, actually, maybe my focus should be on adaptation, not optimization. How do I build an organization that's resilient, that's innovative, that's adaptable, can see these things coming just before they hit, can build a response, and doing that in a number of ways by improving their foresight and thinking more about the future, and by accelerating their decision making, by really starting to speed their ability to respond to those challenges they see coming down the pipeline.
So that's interesting. So philosophical shift, that's a factor that you've seen prior to the COVID situation, and also a move to be more adaptable, to focus on foresight is a second factor.
Yeah,
I want to dig in a bit. Yeah, I want to dig in a bit more to the philosophical shift. But before I do, when you look at those, let's say the decision makers, the executives who are going through this philosophical shift, does that result in one question that you're getting asked more frequently now than in the past?
Yeah, I mean, because I'm a futurist, everyone's always interested in what does the future look like. But the question during this crisis has often been, what do I do now? Like, almost a lot of people's world has been on pause for a few months. It's like, what changes can I make now so that I'm in better shape when things wake up again? And from small businesses, that's been about survival. It's about, what can we do to survive until things start to pick up again? And from large businesses, it's been about that adaptation. What adaptations can we kick off today while we're all at home? We've maybe got a bit more thinking time. What can we do right now, in order to get prepared when things start to turn over at speed again?
So as you know, our audience, the people that we work with primarily, are in finance teams. So I'm interested in taking that topic of philosophical shift, the idea of not being optimized, needing to shift to be more adaptable, and turn it around and maybe make it more specific in terms of finance teams. What's preventing finance teams in particular from becoming more adaptable?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for finance teams is that they're bound, perhaps more than any other part of the organization, into the day-to-day. The time pressures, and particularly those sort of almost seasonal time pressures on finance teams, are unbelievably high. And so actually stepping out of creating the time to step out of that is really, really challenging for finance teams. You combine that with the fact that actually finance has lost some of its strategic power, perhaps some of its political power inside organizations in a lot of places. And so actually being able to demand the resource, demand the time to actually make those strategic changes inside the organization, has been quite challenging for a lot of finance professionals to say, actually, we need, if we're going to be the finance team you need us to be in the future to create this adaptability, we need more resource, whether that's human, financial, computing, whatever it may be. And so, a lot of when I'm speaking to finance professionals, the first question we usually get into is, how do we carve out the time? How do we create the political capital to start to drive this change when perhaps we're not the people with the ear of the leadership anymore? We might have been in the past, but actually maybe now it's marketing, maybe it's sales, maybe it's actually technology leadership who are driving a lot of the decision making, and we feel like we've been a little bit left in the dust. How do we restore that political capital and power and carve out the time we need to do that?
Why do you think that's happened? Why has some of the sheen gone off of finance, or maybe putting it in a more positive way? Why is it that there's been this shift in, let's say, the CEO's ear?
Yeah, I guess it's two things here. One is the new shiny thing is always going to be the sexier thing. We're always looking to the new, right, to the shiny. There was a lot of there was a lot of demand for technology development in those very customer-facing spaces, and lots of companies have this mantra of being customer-centric now, so they're devoting an awful lot of resource to that interface. I think what got lost in that conversation is it's impossible to be customer-centric if things perhaps behind the scenes aren't well informed, well driven, well analyzed, if you don't have that clarity about what's going on behind the scenes. And so, it's been hard for finance professionals to maybe go make the case to say, look, I want to streamline our processes. I want to improve our budgeting and forecasting when a company that's putting in its annual strategies we're customer centric is getting demands to improve customer service, whatever it may be. And I think what's changed now is actually that the connection between the two is much clearer. I think it's a much easier conversation, or it should be now, to say, look, we're in this uncertain environment. You need to see what's coming down the pipeline first. You need the analysis of what's going on in our customer base and our marketplace to take better decisions that allow you to be that customer-centric, corporation you want to be. We're the people who have that data. We need the tools and the technology and the human resource and actually the skills development sometimes to be able to give you as leadership those answers. And so the tide's definitely turning. I think what I'm talking about is a situation that's maybe a legacy of finance losing control of IT in organizations, which happened over the last sort of 20 years. I think it's a legacy of lots of these new, sexy, customer-facing things coming in. But I think the tide's definitely turning. And you see that in conversations with finance professionals now, where maybe, 30% of the room are kind of where you'd expect them to be. 30% are really struggling. But you always find those 20 or 30% who've made that leap, who've done those interesting things, made those investments, rebuilt that political capital, and are doing some really interesting stuff, particularly around that forecasting and foresight piece.
That's really interesting. And again, that relates specifically to the finance function. Let me turn it around a bit more and ask you another question related to philosophical shift. Are there specific sectors or even companies that you've seen that are embracing this notion of that philosophical shift and doing it right? Are there some that are more predisposed, if you will?
There's a huge range of organizations. I mean, in some ways, the organizations I encounter are kind of self-selecting. You generally don't call a futurist unless you're thinking about the future and starting to prepare yourself. But some of the ones that are thinking this way might surprise people. So, one who I'm not allowed to name, but is a massive US manufacturing corporation. If you've ever eaten a bowl of cereal or filled your car with gas, you've used their products because they build the pipelines that make those things. And I had a really fascinating conversation actually with people in their finance function, where they got tasked with streamlining the sales process, because 20 years ago they'd had a nasty shock. One of their customers had gone under, owing them tens of thousands of dollars. And so the finance function back in the 1990s had clamped down and really limited the credit limit for any salesperson without getting 2 or 3 layers of sign-off. And someone in the finance function was tasked with because as part of this much broader approach they were taking in terms of how can we be a much more resilient, adaptable organization. They were changing their structure. They were looking at shared services platforms. And they tasked this woman in the finance function with saying, how do we streamline the sales process, make us more agile and nimble and responsive? And she went through a number of iterations of answers to this, eventually coming back with the simplest answer, which is increase the credit limit. That happened 30 years ago. Most of our customers are very large and very robust, rather than investing in technology to do it. But right through to big names like BMW. BMW is a favorite story of mine from the book for this, because BMW rang me up when they were relaunching their internal leadership training program. So this is the program that every leader in the organization goes through, from sort of bottom to top. And after decades of teaching people continuous process optimization, that the fundamental basis of BMW's success, just refining and improving and getting better and better at building these great cars, they now decided now was the time that they need to teach every leader in the business what they call ambidextrous leadership. This idea that that's no longer good enough. We can't just be constantly focused on optimization. with one hand, we have to keep doing that, improving. But on the other hand, we absolutely have to be focused on adaptability and innovation. And we have to teach every leader in the organization. We have to change the culture of the organization to create that distributed, innovative capability.
That's really interesting. So that adaptability, that focus on innovation, that's all about foresight, about looking into the future, as you've talked about. And interestingly, if I bring it back to finance, we've been talking with finance for some time about how there's this shift from tracking the past to looking at what's coming. I've seen an urgency to that of late. What about you? Have you seen the same? Are you seeing this need for finance almost in the way that you described the situation at that large U.S. manufacturer? Have things really got to a critical point now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there was rumblings sort of, 5, 6, 7 years ago that translated into a few sort of thought leaders 2, 3 years ago, where now I think it's increasingly accepted. And the first big shift I see finance teams making is, at the moment, for too many, looking at the past is still a process. We have to collate all this data, bring it into this collection of spreadsheets, assemble it into something we can understand. Whereas your understanding of the past and the present should be a state. It should be, we should never have to go through a process to understand what has happened. It should just be data that's available to us. The only process should be about how do we forecast the future? How do we look at the future differently? And the connection between that and innovation is really clear. I often say that, friction starts fires. Entrepreneurs are the people who experience friction in something, whether it's buying a house, buying insurance, buying a car, and they don't like the process. They see something wrong with it and they think they can address it. And so they take that bit of friction and they turn it into a fire. They build a business out of it. And inside organizations, we've got to get much, much better at identifying those points of friction, those coming pressure points that are appearing on the horizon, and innovating to adapt to them, to respond to them, to turn them into opportunities rather than threats. And the way we do that is by understanding the future, by looking at the future, by examining the future. And finance has a critical role to play in that. Finance can take the understanding of the present day, of the trends, and it can forecast, it can do scenarios. We talk about scenario planning a lot in futurism. Scenario planning is just storytelling based on some insight about the future. And nobody really has better insight about that than potentially the finance team, if they can use those forecasting tools and devote enough time to that forecasting process to really inform corporate decision making and drive that back into the innovation cycle.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've been having, obviously, a lot of conversations with our customers during the crisis, and the common thread, the common theme is scenario planning, how urgently, how important, how significant that capability is in a way that perhaps many weren't focused on it to the same degree in the past. It's quite fascinating. And what you're describing there, I think of it as horizon scanning, right? Looking outward as opposed to looking backwards on the reporting aspect. How much time do you think finance leaders spend on horizon scanning, or how much time do you think they should be spending on it?
So I think the argument for finance is actually much more than the rest of the organization. For most leaders in an organization, I say they should be spending 1% of their time thinking about the future, which is roughly 1 day every 6 months. And that's it. I mean, even when I say 1% of their time, most leaders look at me in horror and say, where am I going to find 1 day every 6 months to do this? But actually, finances should be much more, because finance should be in many ways the home of scenario planning of the organization. It should be the home of data, and it should be the home of scenario planning, because you've got that sort of web of insights going out into the upstream and the downstream supply chain to say what's happening, what's changing, how are our customers behaving. And so, if I was going to, in an ideal world, the answer is almost all your time, if you're in finance, focused on the future. If you can get to that point where your understanding of the past is a state where the data feeds are automatically collated, translated into comprehensible reports. You can create that self-service infrastructure where a lot of people can answer their own business questions based on finance data without returning it back to you for a process. More and more of your time, a higher and higher percentage of your time should be focused on, okay, what's next? What's coming next? What can we see? How can I inform? How can I collaborate across the business? And so like I say, well, for most leaders in the organization, I'd say 1% of your time is a great starting point. Start with 1%, then try and get to 2, then get to 5, then get to 10, over time. In finance, the end goal for that should be, there's really no upper limit, because if you should be able to get to that point where so much of the past is automated and is a state that actually all of your time is thinking about the future and driving that scenario planning inside the organization.
And was that your experience with BMW as well? Did you find that they became more focused on that future scanning, that looking forward? Did they increase as a consequence of the training?
So one of the really interesting things with BMW was actually it was kind of a structural shift that they may be considering. And then this is very loose, and I don't want to say too much about conversations inside organizations, but in BMW's case, they've obviously clearly been thinking about the future an awful lot. It's more about looking at the sum total of their assets inside the organization and saying, how do these fit into the scenarios we can see in the future? Because clearly, we know that the petrol engine, the internal combustion engine, is going away. We've got all these assets inside the organization. What role do they play in the future, and how can we model a future for each of these different capabilities we have, rather than just modeling them as the organization we used to be? An organization where I think I can absolutely see real evidence of that shift is actually another huge German conglomerate. Suffice to say, they have a big music label and various others. You can look them up fairly easily. But I spent a full day in Berlin with their global finance teams from the CFO down, and in there you could absolutely see this shift in mindset happening from how do we get away from this retrospective view and always being the people who are the experts on the past to being the people who are the experts on the future. And you absolutely saw that in the conversations as the day progressed about how they could take that back to their individual organizations around the world and start to implement some of those behaviors.
This leads me to the term of the day, the term that everybody's using right now, which is AI. It strikes me that AI is going to be that sparkly thing that people are drawn to help them. I mean, I think of our own world where we've been building AI into our products so that customers can use it for anomaly detection. So looking at patterns that occur that can predict what, and therefore you can act on that. What are your views on AI as is it hype? Is it real?
Yeah, I think the problem is part with the term. When people think of artificial intelligence, which is absolutely the right generic term for us to be using, they immediately leap to visions of R2-D2 and C3PO. Whereas actually, the value of AI today is much more prosaic. It feels like we've just invented the wheel, and people are starting to think about, people are waiting to get the value until they can buy a Tesla. It's like there's an awful lot of value in a wheel before we get to the Tesla generation. And you look specifically at the finance function. How you can just start to automate and hand over some really simple capabilities, like you say, starting to detect anomalies to a machine that's going to do that better than a human being, that can filter enormous sums of data. And so you get to this point very quickly, and in finance particularly, where you start to say, do you know what? We've got a bunch of tasks here, and some of them are just better done by AI. And if we can shift all these tasks over to a machine, we can carve out the space for our human beings to do stuff that AI is not going to be able to do for decades, but is incredibly valuable inside our organization. And potentially it shifts the skill set that finance requires. Potentially it shifts the makeup of the finance team. But the potential there for a group of professionals who tell me over and over again that they are weighed down by mechanical labor almost of data management and entry and processing, and constantly being pulled away from the areas where they can add most value as human beings in the organization. It feels like AI has an absolutely enormous role to play, and we shouldn't be waiting for that R2D2 or Johnny 5 Adam generation of technology. We should be starting with the stone wheels we've got today and putting them to use, moving our carts around, because there's enormous value to be had.
That kind of segues into a point that you had mentioned at the outset, that part of what you're seeing is this need for even more rapid decision making. I think I'm putting that correctly. Kind of accelerating the decision making. What are some of the steps that you think organizations can take to get that acceleration, to improve how rapidly they make decisions?
There's really two routes to this, and one of them is actually a conversation I first had at one of your conferences about this concept of hyper-decisive organizations, where you accelerate the flow of information through the organization and improve its quality at the same time. So the information that comes into your organization is rapidly processed, packaged in a form that can drive decision-making and gets to the decision makers. And that's incredibly valuable. I think the thing that surprised me about it when you start to look into this technology is, and it's absolutely technologies like Profix, is actually how relatively cheap it is. I think people have this view of these enormous, sort of data center spanning data processing systems, whereas actually you're getting down into the sort of the cost scale where it makes a lot of sense for very tactical applications. Look, we've got this data flow coming in, we need to package it, turn it into something useful that can drive better decision making. And it starts at that sort of price point now. But the problem with that is it doesn't change the architecture of the organization. And I think one of the things that a lot of our organizations struggle with today is that this decision-making is very centralized. I talked about that case study of the big manufacturing organization. The problem there was that power had been shifted away from the salespeople up 2 or 3 layers of the value chain, of the management chain, to somebody who is getting paid enough to take responsibility, and take some risk. And actually what we have to do is reverse that process. We have to start to push power out to the edges of the organization and give people at the edges the intelligence, the information, the data literacy to take that data in, translate it into answers, and take decisions on their own. And only then do we start to get this really, really rapid, accelerated decision making, which I think the starting point for most organizations which are very centralized is just make those investments, start to accelerate the flow of data, get better quality data to the people making decisions faster, but then start to look at the structure of your organization and where those decisions are made. Push that data literacy out, push those skills of responsibility and autonomy out to the edges of the organization, start to let people at the edges of the organization take some decisions based on that good data that you now have access to.
So you're really talking about active delegation, right? Changing the model within the organization. I think for some executives, some managers, that can feel risky, giving away power, moving it away from the center. But I think for those, I imagine what you found is that for those that are innovative, they have been successful in that. They've been able to move.
Yeah, hugely. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not free, it's not even cheap. It requires investment. You've got to wrap around everybody in the organization who's going to be taking decisions an appropriate set of rules. You've got to put them in a box to say, look, inside this box, if you operate responsibly, you have my 100% support. Go outside the box, that's a different matter. But here's your box. I'm going to define it for you really clearly. I'm going to make sure you've got all the skills and all the support and all the tools you need to operate within that box. And if anything you do inside that box, if it goes wrong, it's not your responsibility. It's mine. There's a conversation in the book I had with the CEO of HSBC about this, where he's trying to do this now. It's another organization who's trying to accelerate decision making by pushing power down to the organization, to people at the edge. But, in terms of examples, there's some great examples of people who've done this already. And here in the UK, we have 2 German supermarkets, Aldi and Lidl, to discounter supermarkets who've grown at an incredible rate over the last 10, 12 years. And part of the reason for that is they've always had this philosophy of distributed decision-making, of pushing power down to the most junior people right at the edge of the organization, wrapping them in that layer of training and giving them responsibility and letting them run with it. And one of my favorite stories about this comes from about 5 years ago, where Lidl, one of these supermarkets, had just rolled out One Direction Easter eggs onto the shelves. And these supermarkets have these incredible middle aisles where you get everything from sort of power tools to riding equipment to fancy chocolates, and it sort of rotates on a week-by-week basis. And they just rolled out these One Direction Easter eggs when, and I'm sorry for this if this is triggering for anybody listening, but Zayn left One Direction. And so they've just rolled out these Easter eggs, and 1/5 of the band leaves. So this information comes in via their social media manager, a young junior employee, edge of the organization, and he has a little weep. And then he turns to the merchandising manager and says, look, we've just rolled out these Easter eggs. What are we going to do? Zayn's gone. And she thinks about this for a second and says, well, 1/5 of the band's gone. We'll knock 1/5 of the price off. And he says, brilliant, I can work with that. And he crafts this beautiful tweet which captures the hearts of One Direction fans around the world. And they flood into this supermarket and clear them out of these Easter eggs, leaving with a really warm, fuzzy glow about this brand. And what's incredible about this story is the two people making those decisions were junior members of staff in their early 20s. And because they were given that autonomy and responsibility, the total decision-making process from tweets coming in and them seeing the news to tweet going out and the information going out across stores across the UK was 20 minutes. 20 minutes to make that huge commercial decision. And I told this story at a presentation about a year later. And in the audience was a non-exec director for one of our much larger supermarkets here in the UK. I won't say which one. And I told her this story, and she talked to me afterwards, and she said that would have taken us 3 days to make that decision. To make it a commercial decision of that scale, and to do all the analysis and make it 3 days, and they can do it in 20 minutes, and that's kind of why they're beating us. So there's lots of these examples of organizations that have made the investment in the skills, in the training, in the development, and wrapped these people in that capability and given them their box and said, run with it, and I will support you if you do. And it's so powerful.
That's an excellent example. That's really excellent. We talked before about AI, trend or sparkly new thing, or a real opportunity to speed up decision-making, look into the future more effectively. Another technology that is, quote, trendy is the cloud. How do you see the cloud affecting rapid decision-making, or do you?
Yeah, I think it's one of those sort of fundamental, sort of foundational technologies now that if you're not leveraging it, you kind of wonder how people are surviving. I mean, I think the current crisis is a really good example. I spoke to somebody from, again, I don't know if I'm allowed to name them, but another client, huge global technology company, chip designer, and briefly before the whole crisis hit, they'd just gone through a whole batch of cloud upgrades. They'd upgraded hardware, they'd upgraded VPNs, they'd upgraded all their collaboration software. And then the crisis hits, and it doesn't matter because they can operate in this distributed fashion. They've changed their processes. They've done the training critically. It's not just the technology. You've got to have the skills and the culture to go around it. But they've done all that. And so found themselves in this very sort of resilient position. And so you look at some of the things I've been talking about over the course of this conversation about that distributing power, where you want to put tools in the hands of people across the organization. The ability to do that with very little friction, with very little effort, to say, look, here's the tools, here's the training, here's the capability. You want to be a decision maker. Here's the data feeds you need. Here's the ability to build your reports. Take that away and run with it. That adaptability and that ability to share that capability is so much greater when you're sitting on that platform of distributed technology where you're not having to worry about hardware, you're not having to worry about, as long as someone's got connectivity, it's there. And so, it's I think people in some way, people went through this sort of trough of disillusionment with the cloud, maybe, it was this super hype technology. Then it was like, okay, I'm a bit bored of hearing about cloud now. And now we're in the period where it's just like, it's there, it's functional, and it's such a great platform on which to build this resilience and this adaptability, whichever aspect of your software or communications domain you're looking at, it's the right technology for an uncertain environment that we're in now.
Yeah, I completely agree. The data points that we're seeing very much say the same thing, that customers are, to turn it around the other way, they don't like the vulnerability. They don't like the risk of on-prem, and that the recent crisis showed that. Whether that has to do with access to or delegation of information, that's the thing that they feel uncomfortable with if they're, and would rather address through cloud, which mitigates that to some degree. That's really interesting.
And particularly in this environment now where there's such a big conversation going on about the future of work and about where we're going to work and how we're going to work. I'm a skeptic that we're about to go through a massive flexible working revolution. I think there's lots of cultural barriers to that. I think there's lots of questions to answer about how we train our junior people, how we build camaraderie and relationships. But I think there's no doubt that the percentage of people working remotely and flexibly is going to increase. So the ability to be in the office, sit around a table, do those collaborative exercises and learn, and then go away and work from home, from the train, from the McDonald's, wherever it may be, and still have access to all that power. I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree. So listen, in terms of this notion of future-proofing your business, what are some of the resources that you'd recommend to folks? What are some of the things that you would point them to in terms of being helpful to achieve that, to do that themselves?
Yeah, I think the starting point for so many organizations is carving out the time, carving out that 1%, 1% of your time where you are focused on the future, and it has to be in a structured fashion. It has to be something that breaks you out of the day to day. And so one of the simple resources is a process that I use called intersections. And intersections is really straightforward. It says, what are the pressure points that we're facing today? Go and speak to people from across your organization, from the most junior to the most senior. Go and talk to your customers, go and talk to your partners, go and read your industry magazines and the national press and Wired, and understand what the pressure points are today. What's causing you pain? And the sorts of questions you're asking are, what stops you being as productive as you could be? Mr. Customer, why don't you, what disappoints you about us? And you start to get these answers, these really sort of cathartic answers from people that highlight things that aren't right in the business today. And the importance of this is none of these big sort of macro trends that you'll usually be thinking about when you're thinking about the future, they don't just touch you anywhere. They touch you where you've already got these pressure points. So wherever these pressure points exist in your organization, these big trends will come in here and they will widen those cracks. And so if you know what those pressure points are, it's enormously valuable. And it also breaks you out of your day-to-day thinking. We're so used to thinking we're the experts in our organization. We know what's going on. Go and talk to people from across the organization. You learn so much, and it's so humbling. So once you've got that, you get your pressure points. You then go and get your trends. Go and look at what the big trends are. I list 5 in the book driven by technology, but really, go and watch some TED Talks. Go and watch what the big tech giants are doing. Go and read Wired magazine. Give yourself an hour, 2 hours, just go and read stuff from adjacent industries or beyond your sector, and just start to note down the consistent trends you find. And then just think about, where are these things going to intersect? Where are these trends going to affect my issues I have today with customer service, the issues I have today with the speed that information moves, the issues I have with legacy technology or legacy infrastructure? And what you find is you get to very rapidly get to a list of things where one hits the other. And then all you do is you put a scale on it. You say, how if this thing happens, how big is it going to be? And whether it's in terms of people we're going to lose, revenue we're going to lose, just put a rough scale on it. Pick the top 5, put them on your to-do list. Deal with them over the next 6 months, repeat the process again. and just do that iterative process every 6 months. What are the existential threats based on the pressure points we're facing today, the macro trends that are coming in, bring the two together, pick 5, deal with them, repeat.
That's really valuable. I heard somebody describe a futurist as somebody you both fear and appreciate. And, because I think they speak to truth. And sometimes that's a scary thing. If I go back to your points about delegation, for example, sometimes the points that you're bringing to an organization are points they don't necessarily want to hear. I think what's that term? You're calling their baby ugly,
Yeah, it's always fun walking into a boardroom and calling somebody's baby ugly.
Yeah. Now that said, here's the broad question for you. What if the crystal ball is the cliche term, but if you were to look into your crystal ball, what would you expect business to look like in a year from now? You think it's going to be different in a year from now? You talked earlier on about social working and home working, but broader than that, what do you forecast?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we're going to see over the next 6 months is going to be what I'm calling the snapback, right? We've been cooped up, locked down, kept from our offices and our friends and our colleagues. We're going to jump right back in as far as possible into the way things were. And so, for the most part, in 12 months' time, I think business 2021 is going to look a lot like business 2019, assuming we're not facing second or third waves of this pandemic, and that's not looking likely at the moment. The flip side to that is two things. First of all, we're continuing to see these waves of high frequency change blow through different industries. And so, we've seen it in music. The music industry has been turned on its head, 15 years ago. We've seen the media industry turned on its head. We've seen retail turned on its head. We're now seeing banking and automotive industries completely turned upside down. Every industry is going to be hit by one of those waves of high frequency change at some point. So while on the macro scale, business 2021 is going to look a lot like business 2019, inside each of those industries, you're going to be seeing these waves of high frequency change turning something upside down. Then, of course, there's the possibility that we get another one of these globe-spanning transformations like the coronavirus pandemic, whether it's driven by environmental change, whether it's driven by supply chain collapse, whatever it may be. And so I think the big shift to business 2021 is this expectation of uncertainty. And I think that the organizations that are in the best shape 12 months from now are the ones who've learned from this crisis, who've used it to sort of sharpen their focus on the fact that we're in a different world now, that the philosophy has to change. We've got to move away from constantly just doubling down on the business we used to have and focusing more of our time, more of our effort, more of our investment on what comes next. And the big difference for business 2021 will be the success stories we look at are the ones that will probably be perhaps less profitable, but much more adaptable and much more resilient.
That's really interesting. It's one of the key things I take away from what you're giving us here is it's about those fractures, the fracture points, that there are invariably the fracture points, and not to be afraid of them, but to inspect them, be aware of them, because they will be accentuated in crisis and there will be future crises. That's very interesting.
Yeah. And the best time to learn about them is before the crisis.
Right, exactly. Just before I let you go, if there's one thing that you would leave with the audience, what would that be?
Yeah, I think the book is a very practical book. It starts from this position of this philosophical shift and moves into 3 practical changes. One about how you look at the future, so an expanded version of the technique I was just talking about. Talks about how you accelerate decisions, some of the things we talked about today in more depth, and actually talks about how you structure an organization as well, about how actually the shape of organizations today to be resilient and successful is changing. But if I was going to leave you with one thing, it's that philosophical shift. For me, that's the most important thing, is that you've got to understand that philosophical change now. You are not going to build a resilient, future-ready business if you are constantly doubling down on yesterday's business model, if you are focusing on continuous process optimization, on eking out more profit, more growth from where you were. You shift your mindset to what it's going to take to still be a successful brand, a successful business in 10 to 20 years. And that means being more adaptable and shift your investment accordingly.
That's excellent. Well, Tom, this has been a really enjoyable and valuable conversation. Thank you. I think I've managed to weave in the questions that were popping up into our conversation. I got a great deal out of it. It's a pleasure to work with you. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations. Thank you very much. And thanks to our audience for joining us.
Thanks, Mike.